Okay, all right, let's go ahead and get to some very serious topics. But starting with, we were talking yesterday about how Trump has basically taken the Houthis up on their deal to back up for a second. Okay. Houthis have been doing their operations in response to the Israeli genocide in Gaza. During the ceasefire, the brief Gaza ceasefire, they stopped all activities. When the ceasefire ended, they resumed activities, but just vis-a-vis Israel. They were not bombing or bothering U.S. ships. But we started bombing them aggressively and killing a lot of civilians and Signal Gate and all of that sort of stuff. They have long said, and a drop site interview to Ryan and Jeremy's credit, actually interviewed Houthi leadership who said, listen, we've always said, if you don't bomb us, we won't bomb you. So apparently Trump decided to take them up on that deal and decided to stop bombing them. And in response, they are not supposed to bomb us either, even as they continue their hostilities vis-a-vis Israel. So Trump gets asked about this yesterday and has just about the most Trumpian answer of all time. So let's go ahead and take a listen to that.
But so we take their word for it. It was, we hit them very hard. They had a great capacity to withstand punishment. They took tremendous punishment. And, you could say there's a lot of bravery there. That it was amazing what they took. But we honor their commitment and their word. They gave us their word that they wouldn't be shooting ships anymore, and we honor that.
We honor the bravery of the Houthis.
Very brave. We honor their commitment. I mean, it's just like, it reminds me of some of the things that Trump would say in his first term, like when he was talking about Putin. He's like, "What, you think we don't have so many killers? Yeah, you think we're so innocent here?" Or
he's going full Chomsky.
Yeah, or the way he would, talk about meeting with North Korea or meeting with the Taliban. Like, I feel like we got a little more of this Trump in the first administration. This was a bit of a throwback, but it's also funny just in the context of, a bunch of lefties, Hassan in particular, have gotten a lot of shit for talking about the Houthis and being like, it's brave what they're doing. And here you have Trump being like, they're very brave. What can I say? I honor their commitment.
Imagine Barack Obama calling the Houthis brave. Imagine how Republicans would react.
Oh my God.
Honoring the bravery of the Houthis.
You can't. You just can't.
No.
You cannot. It would
only
be
Trump. Only Trump.
We would still be talking about the scandal of it to this day. I'm not even kidding. It is
kind of scandalous. It's kind of a crazy thing to say, but sorry, Hassan, but it is kind of crazy from the president who's in charge of the United States foreign policy, and yet, here we are.
Here we are.
So, but I guess a little bit of good news on that front too, and cannot be divorced from the broader context of the administration heading to Oman this weekend for negotiations on the Iran nuclear deal. We have some updates on that front as well.
Yeah, we do. But before we get to that, I want to talk about this report from Reuters, which is deeply troubling and really significant. Let's put this up on the screen. So they were able to get this exclusive report that the U.S. and Israel are discussing a possible U.S.-led administration for Gaza. Let me repeat that. A U.S.-led, indefinite administration, occupation, you could say, of Gaza. Let me read you a little bit of this report because just the utter insanity of this, I cannot possibly be overstated. The U.S. and Israel have discussed the possibility of Washington leading a temporary post-war administration of Gaza. According to 5 people familiar with the matter, the high-level consultations have centered around a transitional government headed by a U.S. official that would oversee Gaza until it had been demilitarized and stabilized, and a viable Palestinian administration had emerged. I'm sure that'll be easy, Emily. No problems there. According to the discussions, which remain preliminary, there'd be no fixed timeline for how long such a U.S.-led administration would last. So we're talking about literally could last forever, which would depend on the situation on the ground, the 5 sources said. Those sources, who spoke on condition of anonymity, compared the proposal to the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq that Washington established in 2003, shortly after the U.S.-led invasion that toppled Saddam Hussein. Emily, how did that go? Can we check back in on that? How did that work out for us? Was
no
that
spoilers.
a great idea? Did we execute it well? Did it, foment tons of terrorism and horror for years to come?
I think we were able to successfully win the love and affection of the people and establish a democracy.
Mission accomplished is what I heard.
What we did was spread democracy. And democracy is contagious, as you know.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Especially in the Middle East.
I these words, they truly, I mean, few things are shocking to me with Trump at this point, but he ran in opposition to the Iraq War. This was one of his campaign innovations. Calling Jeb, I mean, we all loved watching him call out Jeb Bush to his face on stage for his brother going into Iraq. And that was one of the ways he really did separate himself from the pack and really did seem to represent some sort of a break from the traditional Republican establishment. And now here you are talking about perhaps the most disputed land on the entire planet. And we are going to administer it indefinitely. And the model is the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq. I mean, the human horror of it, the stupidity of it, the insanity of it, I literally cannot get over it.
And of course, we fund one side of the dispute in that conflicted territory to the tune of billions of dollars a year. So trying to pitch that to the Palestinian people, you're already going to be like, well, what are you talking about? This is just basically the same thing as giving Israel the land.
100%.
And
yes.
I can't tell if this Reuters story is a leak from people who think it's a really good idea or people who think it's a really bad idea. I couldn't tell genuinely in the story if this is a trial balloon to try to acclimate people to this idea, or it was to try to blow the whistle and say someone needs to stop this. My instinct is that this is people saying this is a really great idea. Let's slowly try to acclimate the media and the public to, this is a quote from the article, the quote, high-level consultations have centered around a transitional government, as you read, headed by a U.S. official that would oversee Gaza until it had been demilitarized and stabilized and a viable Palestinian administration had emerged. So just zeroing in on that, we have no idea what a timeline would look like in that case. Until a viable Palestinian administration had emerged, the word viable is incredibly vague. That could mean a million different things, and it could mean a million years for as long as, as far as we're concerned, because viable is going to be in the eyes of the U.S. beholder and the Israeli beholder in this case. And it's very hard to believe that Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition won't always be in power, but believes, you know, was totally at odds with Joe Biden about the question of a two-state solution, doesn't believe in a two-state solution. So what does viable mean?
That's right. How did our viable government in Afghanistan work out? How did that one go as well? I mean, I had the same question about who was leaking this and why. And then the other question I have is Trump teased this big Middle East announcement. Is this it?
I think so. I think that's exactly what it is.
You do?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't even know what to say. I don't even know what to say. But it's consistent with what he's been saying all along about we are gonna own Gaza. So this is
the roadmap to the Gaza Riviera, basically.
Yeah, that's right. And you know, again, I think you have to take him seriously. I think he got this idea in his head. And his eyes lit up at the idea of like the beachfront property or whatever. And now here we are planning some indefinite, endless occupation of Gaza. It's just an absolute horror. And at the same time, the Israelis now, the mask is totally off. You know, in the beginning days, Emily, I'm sure you remember, we had all these conversations about like, well, what's the day after the war and what's the plan? And of course, Bibi would never say, you know, he would always, oh, well, we're just focused on the hostages. Also, by the way, update on that in a moment. Stay tuned for how much they care about the hostages and what a priority that is for them in this new expanded Gaza operation that they just authorized. In any case, they have now made it plain. The goal is we want to permanently occupy Gaza. We want to flatten Gaza. You and Ryan covered this earlier this week. And some Democrats are starting to be a little bit more vocal. Senator Chris Van Hollen, who I have to say has been, compared to other Democrats, he actually had traveled to the region previously under the Biden administration and was blowing the whistle.
That's right. That was him.
Was blowing the whistle on the, all of the ways that they were blocking aid and how insufficient the aid was. At least some aid was getting in at that point, but how insufficient it was, and that it was the Israelis' fault that more aid wasn't getting into the Strip. So he has been, a vocal critic here for a while. He's now going one step further and saying that the Israeli plan is brazen ethnic cleansing. Let's go ahead and take a listen to that.
I want to talk about the humanitarian disaster in Gaza. It's now been well over 60 days since the Netanyahu government imposed a total blockade of humanitarian assistance to the people of Gaza, not allowing any food or any other humanitarian assistance to reach the over 2 million civilians there, withholding food and humanitarian assistance as a weapon of war is flat out illegal under international law. It is collective punishment, pure and simple. And now we're told that the Netanyahu government plans to seize and reoccupy huge parts of Gaza. And recently, Ben-Gvir, one of the most ultra-extreme members of the extremist Netanyahu government, was in Washington calling for the implementation of the Donald Trump plan to essentially force 2 million Palestinian civilians to leave Gaza. That is simply ethnic cleansing by another name.
And Ben-Gvir, of course, very influential in this administration and, very much in line with what many members of the Netanyahu government and, frankly, much of the Israeli public also want at this point. And, we are more than 2 months since any food, water, medicine has been allowed to enter the Strip. More than 2 months. And you've got roughly 2 million people there. We really don't know how many people there are still alive at this point. President Trump had suggested the number was lower at this point, but in any case, you have millions of people there, and they will all die if food does not come in. We already have dozens who have died of starvation, children in particular suffering gravely from malnutrition, and that's where we are at this date.
Let's put the next element up on the screen. This is a tweet from DropSite, which looked at a Times of Israel report from yesterday, May 7th. And Krystal, this just makes your stomach sink. The headline here is, leaked Israeli document rescuing captives ranked last in Gaza war goals. A leaked Israeli military document shows that rescuing captives in Gaza is listed last among 6 official objectives for a planned ground offensive in Gaza. And let's just go through these 6. Because if you're reading these as steps, and I think that's a correct way to read them, by the time you get to 6, it just, again, it makes your stomach sink. 1, defeating Hamas. 2, achieving operational control over Gaza. 3, demilitarizing the territory. 4, striking Hamas government targets. 5, concentrating and relocating the population. 6, rescuing the captives. And Netanyahu is already facing regular protests from the hostage families because many of them want him to make a deal to rescue any living hostages, obviously, and to return the bodies of any deceased hostages. But this has always been the fundamental early criticism. I mean, going back to late October.
That's right.
Of the Netanyahu administration from hostage families, not all of them, but some of them, who felt that actually rescuing the hostages was taking a backseat, basically, to this broader goal of taking over Gaza, to put it in the words of Netanyahu, obliterating Hamas, eliminating Hamas. But in the process of eliminating Hamas, do you eliminate the lives of hostages? In some cases, we know that is likely what happened.
Yeah.
And secondly, because this tweet says, despite repeated public claims by Israeli leaders that freeing them is the war's top priority. But you know what? There's been mixed messages on that. They've kind of tried to have it both ways, saying that the hostages are their priority, but also that the top aim of the war is to eliminate Hamas. And those goals are not necessarily categorically compatible.
That's exactly right. And that is what many hostage families and many Israelis recognize. And that really has been the focal point, from what I can tell, of a lot of the protests. If you ask Israelis, according to the polls, has the war been too brutal on Palestinians? The number that say that is like 4%. It's shockingly low. But there's been a lot of dissent around the issue of what the impact is on the hostages of this all-out assault, genocidal assault on Gaza. And it has long been clear that Bibi and co. did not care about the hostages. They were happy to use them for propaganda value, and they aggressively used. You remember in the early stages that the pictures of the hostages were everywhere, and if you weren't fully behind the Israeli war effort, well, you don't care about the hostages, and you just want them to die. And for a long time, from the beginning, what hostage families and others have been saying is, yeah, but you don't know where our family members are. So if you are bombing and starving this population, our family members are there too. So if you actually want to prioritize the hostages, what you would prioritize is, remember, there was that brief deal early in the war that there was a brief ceasefire and there was an exchange of hostages from both the Israeli and the Palestinian side. That's when most of the hostages who were released during that time period. That is how you actually get the hostages back, is through diplomatic negotiations and a ceasefire. Hamas has said from the beginning, we'll do an all-for-all exchange. You release all of the Palestinian hostages, prisoners that you're holding. We will release all of the Israeli hostages that we are holding as well. So it has always been clear, and the military efforts to rescue any of the hostages have been, I think there was one that was successful, and it also included mass civilian death and a lot of chaos and carnage as a result of that operation to rescue hostages. So it's always been very clear. If you actually want to secure hostages, then you need to negotiate. The diplomatic resolution is the way that you're going to save hostage lives. And we were told that, the hostages are the #1 priority. And now, again, as I said before, the mask is coming off of Israel. They no longer feel the need to lie and pretend like hostage lives are the #1 priority. And, this leaked document just confirms, actually, it's the last on the list of war aims. The least important war aim is to secure the release of the hostages at this point.
Well, and it was always for the sake of this goal that, again, was unattainable without complete and utter civilian destruction, because we knew, we could tell in the early stages of the war that Hamas was not going to be defeated without that, that they were already reconstituting within, 6 months? Was it about 6 months? They were already reconstituting control and government authority in particular areas of Gaza, like in Rafah. So it was all, I think if I were, a hostage family, that is what would weigh most heavily on me, is that they're not, what is the end here? I don't think anybody ever really knew, because, the end for many people, let's say, was just this goal of quote unquote eliminating Hamas, but what that would actually look like, when that would end, if it was attainable. Those were the questions I think that were haunting a lot of the families of the hostages.
All right, let's go ahead and get to this update with regard to Iran negotiations. J.D. Vance, this was in Munich yesterday, correct? That he was speaking, getting asked about
He returned.
He returned to Munich. By the way, the tone this time,
so different.
Much softer.
Yeah, it was interesting.
A little chastened. Was kind of, what did you make of that?
Well, yeah, it was interesting because he started off by acknowledging, the elephant in the room and breaking the ice, cutting through any tension, and saying I wasn't sure if I was going to be invited back. And his tone overall, it was a conversation and not a speech. So I think that helped it, the tone be more, a little bit more, what's the right word? Maybe chastened, or just buttoned down. It was a bit more relaxed
like
and
the
friendly.
J.D. Vance that was on stage with Tim Walz.
Yes, it was very much
like a very nice, moderate dude.
Very much like that.
We're trying to get along here. Whereas the first speech was very aggressive.
Yes, it was very prickly and abrasive. And this was him, I think, realizing that you can catch more flies with honey.
And I think also the trade war has changed the dynamics, where also they feel like they need Europe to side with the U.S. against China, and so there have been some shifts there. In any case,
he did have a really good quote where he said basically the point is not U.S. versus Europe, and I don't want things to seem that way. Though you can understand why the Europeans, by the way, interpreted that earlier Munich speech as U.S. versus Europe. But he's saying that's not the point. The point is that we actually need each other. It was actually I think a much more mature version of the argument, and obviously he's had a couple of months to get feedback and hear from people about how that first argument landed.
Don't forget, too, that the Signalgate chats that leaked out, where J.D. Vance is trying to make the case against the strikes in Yemen by being like, oh, we're just bailing out those crummy Europeans again. And Hegseth, I think, was the one that chimed in, right?
Yeah.
Or who was like, yeah, we can't stand them. There's a lot of Euro bashing going on in that chat.
Yeah.
And they read those as well, so I'm sure they were also not super happy about the contents of those messages.
Super quickly, I pulled up the quote just because I think it gives a good flavor of his tone yesterday. He said, quote, I wasn't sure if after February I'd get the invitation back. Everything that I said there applied as much to the previous American administration as it did any government in Europe. So he was saying, sort of humbling himself and saying, well, not himself, but humbling his country and saying the Biden administration was just as bad as I think you guys are. It's like Biden, Starmer, same thing.
Biden administration wasn't kidnapping students off the street for writing op-eds.
But
so
then
that part always goes unsaid.
Yeah. Then he goes on to say it's not Europe bad, America good. Both Europe and the U.S. we got a little off track. So that's a night and day tonal difference. But he was in conversation this time, so I guess it's not like a scripted speech attack. He was talking to some guy up on stage.
Gotcha. Okay, so in part of that talking to some guy up on stage, he gets asked about the status of the Iran nuclear deal negotiations. Interesting comments here. Let's take a listen.
So there are a couple issues with the earlier agreement, the JCPOA,
right,
as it's called here in the United States, and I assume in Europe. But here the two big issues with that agreement are, number one, the enforcement or the inspections regime was incredibly weak. And I don't think that it actually served the function of preventing the Iranians from getting on the pathway to a nuclear weapon. That's one thing that must be different. And then second, yes, we believe that there were some elements of their nuclear program that were preserved under JCPOA that, yes, they weren't nuclear weapons. Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon, but allowed Iran to sort of stay on this glide path towards a nuclear weapon if they flip the switch and press go. And we have to think about this not just in terms of Iran, which, again, the president has said this. We think that there is a deal here that would reintegrate Iran into the global economy, that would be really good for the Iranian people, but would result in the complete cessation of any chance that they could get a nuclear weapon. And that's what we're negotiating towards.
So what did you think of his comments there, Emily? What was noteworthy?
Yeah, I mean, really interesting because they need the buy-in of Senate Republicans who have been hearing these leaks, the broad contours of a potential Trump-Iran negotiation and saying that sounds exactly like the JCPOA. The Foundation for Defense of Democracy is very hawkish on this. Some of their folks have been making that criticism. And I think the Trump administration knows that they need the buy-in of a significant part of the Republican coalition, and they're not going to get that for the JCPOA, even if it's Donald Trump. You saw, we didn't talk about this yesterday, but Senator Tom Tillis coming out against Trump's D.C. attorney pick, Ed Martin, and tariffs had Rand Paul, for example, bringing together this bipartisan coalition to try and get a vote to take back, at least symbolically, Congress's power over trade. So I think they realize that on the highest priority issues, and I cannot think of a higher priority issue for the hawks in the Republican Party, the remaining neoconservatives, a Tom Cotton, a Lindsey Graham, whatever it is, you cannot just copy and paste JCPOA, even if you're Donald Trump, which is one of the reasons actually people ended up getting on the Trump bandwagon back in 2015 and 2016 because he was such an opponent of JCPOA. So I think what J.D. Vance was doing yesterday was making a substantive and fair criticism of JCPOA's oversight, the oversight, let's say, regime that was in JCPOA. Like, you have to be able to verify what Iran is actually doing, otherwise the whole thing kind of falls apart and it's kind of useless. So I think it's a reasonable criticism. I also think it was a way to distance the Trump plan.
Say this is totally different. This is nothing like the other plan. Like, this is way better than that. So
it's not impossible
as well.
It's not impossible that they land on, especially if we're grading on the curve of neoconservative Republican Party lawmakers. It's not impossible that they land on a solution here that is much better than your typical Republican or maybe even your typical Democrat would have negotiated. But that's obviously remains to be seen. They're negotiating in Oman. It's the weird thing of the Trump era is that because of the oddities in the coalition and because of Trump's very eccentric, to say the least, approach to these negotiations, they sometimes end up in good places. We'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. Fingers crossed that they just, get back into something approximating JCPOA, but are able to put some rhetorical flourish on that keeps most Republicans on board, because I do think that is a genuine risk, given the fact, we're about to transition to block on the Medicaid cuts, the block on what's going on with MAHA. There are cracks that are starting to emerge. And as this administration gets more unpopular across a broader range of issues, as the economic numbers get more uncertain, it just gives you a lot less room to navigate. And also as the midterms get closer, and many of these, the members who are up are looking at their reelection bids and getting very nervous. And then, of course, there are such hawkish organized forces in Washington that the vast majority of the Republican caucus has been aligned with. So it will be difficult for them to persuade their own caucus that this is a deal worth negotiating. We shouldn't just go to war with Iran, which of course would be an utter disaster.
They have been flipping out over it as soon as it became likely or possible that Trump was going to pursue a broad plan or a plan that broadly resembled JCPOA in some way or another, meaning allowing for some enrichment for at least civilian purposes in the agreement, quote unquote civilian purposes.
Yeah.
And that's, it's not that they don't have a point, that's something that people should absolutely be concerned about. But is it realistic? No. In all likelihood, it's not realistic to start, let's say, thawing these tensions or cooling these tensions without coming to some sort of agreement that has, in an agreement, you have to give and take a little bit, and you end up with no agreement whatsoever.
And the administration has been all over the map with regard to enrichment. J.D. Vance there seemed to say no enrichment. Others have said no enrichment. Donald Trump got asked about it, and he said he's not sure. So, which is good. I'm glad he said that.
I think Witkoff's gone back and forth as well.
Yeah, I think that's right too. And I don't remember if it was in the clip we played there or not, but J.D. Vance made a comment during there saying that no country has ever had civilian enrichment and not ended up with a nuclear weapon, and that is just not true at all. Japan, Brazil, Germany, Netherlands are among countries that enrich uranium and haven't pursued nuclear weapons. So that part was not particularly encouraging, but we'll see where it all goes.
Hey, that's a rare glimmer of optimism, I suppose.
That's the best you're going to get from me.
Thanks, Krystal.
Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show ad-free and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show, help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.